Okay, hi there. This is Mrs. Gabriel. I'm going over chapter 6, modules 18 and 19, maybe in this presentation. If I can go quickly enough, you're going to have to pause and take your time looking at some information so that I don't have to pause and take more time on the video. This is all about population and community ecology. And if you want to know the objectives, go ahead and read that on your own. So we're specifically in this chapter going to look at populations and communities. If you look at this right here, we are not going to look at lots of information about individual species. We're going to look at the entire population of a species or of two groups of species. And we're going to look at how groups of species interact with one another. We are not really going to throw in a whole lot of other abiotic factors, which would be like an ecosystem level of complexity. So these are the ones we're mostly going to focus on. We're going to start with, I want you to learn a little bit about a local case study of the emerald ash borer. This is the little guy that's infesting, it's an invasive species infesting ash trees in Maryland. Population ecologists study the factors that regulate population abundance and distribution, which we're going to learn more about. So we look at pests, we look at natives, we look at endangered species, we look at threatened species, we look carefully at those organisms that provide benefits to us. These are beneficial services. And we look at ones that harm us or harm our ecosystems, which eventually will harm us. So we have to study how the populations of various organisms interact with the environment, how they interact with other organisms, in order for us to figure out how to save them, or in this case, how to eradicate them, how to get rid of them. So we have native ash trees in Maryland. Ash trees are one of the most common landscaping trees used in the US, and they're common in western Maryland forests. Ash wood is used for, let me show you, that's part of an ash tree. The wood is used for building materials, hardwood flooring, cabinets, baseball bats, tool handles. Ash is actually the most common tree in Baltimore. We have like hundreds of thousands of ash trees, and it makes up about 12% of our total population of ash trees. However, it is declining very quickly, and we want to save them because I just told you what we use them for. In addition to the fact that because they make up 12% of our tree population, if we lose our ash trees, we lose 12% of our trees. So now that we understand a little more about ash borers, let me tell, well, actually, you don't understand much more about them. Let me tell you a little bit about the population. So these guys, if you look right here, you'll see the larva stage, and their eggs are laid in the tree. And when the eggs hatch, they bore through here and they cause a lot of problems and they wreak havoc on the tree. The tree loses its bark. The bark is supposed to protect the tree. When the bark is gone, we have a problem. So scientists try and learn more about these ash borers. They try to learn, like, what do they do? How do they live? And how can we get rid of them? And they're trying a couple things to try and get rid of them, such as spraying insecticides on the trees that are infested, or releasing biological controls like parasitoids, a wasp, a type of wasp that is going to lay eggs in the larvae and kill them. Let's hope it works. So we're going to go over each of these in more detail. Just remember that these are characteristics that we study when we're trying to understand a population. So these are all the things that we looked at when we tried to learn about the ash borer. We used in class something on size. We looked at the mark and recapture method to estimate how many largemouth bass might be in a lake. Do you remember using that method in class? We actually modeled it with white beans. They were black-eyed peas, really. So there's other techniques that are used besides the mark and recapture method, which was also called the Lincoln method. We'll learn more about this another time. Population characteristics and distributions can happen randomly. We can see them with no pattern randomly. We can see them in definitely a uniform distribution pattern or distribution. And meerkats are a cute little example of clump distributions. We also look at sex ratio, age ratio. An example of random distribution is really common with like random seed dispersal. The seed will grow wherever it lands as long as where it lands is a welcoming environment, which is why we get this random distribution of trees. This is the condor. I'll tell you a little more about him in a minute. So the condor has a very characteristic distribution. These are not condors. It's a territorial animal. So animals that are territorial are usually going to have that uniform distribution. Plants that have toxins to help them have the space that they need are going to just be distributed this way because the toxin only reaches so far. So ecologists need to know about this condor because the condor's distribution patterns will help us help it survive when we introduce it back into the wild. This is a threatened animal. A little more about the condor also is that it's a K-selected species. Condors nest in hollowed out portions at the top of redwood trees. They also nest in small caves and on cliff faces, like the cliffs of the Grand Canyon. Condors eat an average of 2 to 3 pounds of meat every time they feed. They do not feed on live animals. They feed usually on something that has died. This is just a condor that's mad at a wolf. While condors eat dead and decaying animals, they take great care in cleaning themselves. Their wingspan is about 10 feet and they can fly like 15,000 feet above sea level. They can live to be 60 years old in the wild, and they don't breed until like they're 6 years old. And when they breed, they only lay one egg every 2 years after reaching sexual maturity. So that's part of why they're a K-selected species. They're very social birds. While they can fly hundreds of miles in a day, they prefer to feed and roost like around others. When they find a mate, they mate for life. So just a little fun stuff about condors that we're trying to protect. Okay, these are meerkats. Meerkats, cute, cute. They clump in order to detect predators. Large groups of clumped populations help with feeding opportunities and escaping predators. Other examples of clumped populations might be schools of fish. And the lower picture right here, just to give you a little bit on what I'm about to tell you about, this is sage. And these are nesting gametes, which you saw in a previous photo. So I'm going to show you a bunch of examples here, but I'm going to click through these examples of distribution. You're going to say if the distribution is random, uniform, or clumped. For example, nesting gannets will have an equal distance between them and the other gannets, which is an example of uniform distribution. So I'm just going to do these every second, and then you can pause the video and unpause the video. So I don't have to keep reading. So good job. I bet you got them all right. Okay, population size. A couple things that we consider with population size is whether it's density dependent or density independent. So when you looked in your book at all this stuff, you should have been like, this is all in paragraphs and I don't really understand it. I'll just write some stuff down. Well, that's what my job is, to help you understand it a little more. So populations can die, they can be wiped out, and sometimes they're wiped out because of something that has everything to do with their density. So these are examples of things that matter if their density is high. If there is a food shortage and they have a high density, that means like 100 bunnies per, quarter acre. If they have, which is incredibly dense, and there's a food shortage, well, that's going to change the population size because they're not all going to be able to eat. However, if there was only 2 or 3 bunnies living in that same quarter acre and there was a food shortage, they'd be fine. If there was a flood and there's only 3 or 4 bunnies there, the 3 or 4 bunnies are going to die. As well as if there's 100 bunnies in the flooded area. So that means if they die, that it really doesn't have anything to do with their density. So it's independent. If there's a fire, it doesn't matter how dense they are, they're going to die if there's a fire regardless. If there's pesticides that could kill them, it doesn't matter if there's 2 bunnies or 100 bunnies. So it's independent of the size of the population. That is the difference between density dependent and density independent. Factors that influence population size are density dependent and density independent. Just remember that has to do with control of the size. So density dependent is food, nutrients, nest sites. They're all example of density dependent limiting resources. So food is density dependent because a smaller population requires less total food than a larger population or a more dense population. Food scarcity will have a greater negative effect on the survival and reproduction of individuals in a large, more dense population than in a small population. So that makes food a limiting resource. So if you still don't know, you can write this down. That might help you remember it better, but I'm going to keep going. Just ask yourself this: is the factor more likely to cause death if the organism has more neighbors? That means it's density dependent. Okay, this shows the growth and decline of a reindeer population. Humans introduced about 25 of these in Alaska in the early 1900s, and the population did really well. So they increased rapidly with a J-shaped curve. This is called exponential growth, J-shaped. They just had lots and lots of babies. The babies had lots of babies. They did really, really well. They had lots of food, no limiting resources. That was exponential growth. Then in 1938, because they ate all their food, there was no more food left. Food became a density dependent factor and the population crashed. Okay, the Module 18 answers are right here, and the Module 19 objectives are here. I'm going to keep going. You can check them on your own with a pause. So I love, love, love this module, Module 19. Okay, we're going to learn about population growth models here. And I really spent some time in class on this. You need to be able to explain it and recognize what is correct and what is incorrect in statements about this. So we're going to look at growth rate, intrinsic growth rate, which is denoted by a little italicized R, and the exponential growth model and the logistic growth model. So this is the exponential growth model. You're going to learn about this in math class as well. So this is the formula. Really, this is all about just how can we use this to predict how many bunnies we're going to have here. How can we use this if our bunny population is growing like this and we have this information right here? Then what is the bunny population going to be at this point in time right here? And we can use, by knowing that this is how populations grow when there are no resources limiting their growth. When we know there's no resources that are limited, they're going to grow. Their population size is going to grow like this. Their size is going to grow in this J-shaped curve. And the J-shaped curve, by the way, is more births occurring at each step in time. More births every step in time. It can be used to predict population size at any moment in time. The growth rate is the number of offspring an individual can produce in a given time minus the deaths of the individual. Here's a little more information. So intrinsic growth rate, that's supposed to be an italic R. Intrinsic growth rate is when there is no limiting resource. All the food you want, all the space you want, everything you want. And that population is doing so well, and that is when it grows, the population size grows intrinsically. N of t right here, is the estimate of the population's future size after some time. If we know the intrinsic growth rate, if we know that, the little r of a population, and the number of reproducing individuals that are in the population, N of O, then we can estimate the population's future size, N of t, after so much time. We have to know our time. We have to decide this time and this time. We have to make that decision. This is the exponential growth model. And that's all you're going to need to know from me for this chapter. We're going to practice this stuff when we're done with all our duckweed. So if we know the intrinsic growth rate of a population, little r, and the number of reproducing individuals that are currently in the population, then we can estimate the population's future size. All right, so 3 facts about this chart. Pause, tell yourself those facts, and then play to see how you did. Okay, so logistic growth is just a continuation of exponential. So Populations do not always grow exponentially forever and ever. Eventually, their resources are going to be limited. They're going to reach a carrying capacity, and that's when logistic growth occurs. So we're going to look at K, the carrying capacity, which, remember, happens because now our resources are limited. And logistic growth is an S-shaped curve. Here is an example of where our J curve started, and then growth started slowing down, and then we went into S. So that where we flatline here is the carrying capacity. So the y-axis is the size of the population, and then this is time. So years go by, years go by, years go by, or it could be months. Depends what kind of organism you're talking about. So the population's here. The population has no limiting resources, so it's growing exponentially. We have, we could be doubling in size even. And then as soon as it starts kind of slowing down, it's no longer growing at the same rate it was growing here. The growth begins to slow. We're going to level off where the environment can hold this number of that organism. That point right there is called the carrying capacity, which is denoted by a big italic K. Elephants, humans, and whales take a long time to get to K. Roaches and bunnies, they don't take long at all. It can just be like, for roaches, it could be a year. For bunnies, it could just be 2 or 3 years. Elephants, it can be decades. Notice where the growth begins to slow down. So this is halfway between here and here. So when we see this, when we see it slowing, we now know from monitoring other populations and can predict where the carrying capacity of a population will be. So exponential growth describes a continuous fixed rate, but populations don't really do this forever. For this reason, ecologists have modified this model to incorporate the environmental limits, and that's why we have this logistic growth model. So remember, it starts exponentially, but then it starts slowing down, and the population approaches the carrying capacity, which is K. As a population nears about 1/2 of K, the population's growth slows, and then eventually it gets to the full K. It stops growing in size. That's your S-shaped curve. Okay. You're going to pause and tell a couple things about it, and then you're going to check your responses with what's here. All right, so populations also oscillate, or they go through cycles of overshoots and die-offs. They oscillate around the carrying capacity. So here's the carrying capacity. This is where we might have like 100,000 organisms. That's what this environment can hold. They oscillate around here. If food becomes scarce or other conditions change, a population can experience like, okay, we're running out of food. Oh, we're going to die off. Not everyone's going to survive. Our population's going to decrease. And then there's more food available. So they're going to fluctuate. The population can fluctuate here. This part's called the overshoot. This part's called the die-off. When a population becomes larger than the environment's carrying capacity, it's called the overshoot. A rapid decline in deaths is when we call it a die-off. Rapid decline. You're going to learn soon about K and R selected species. Note that overshoot and die-off is more common with R selected species. Just remember that. I'm just going to keep saying that so it's not as overwhelming. However, predator-prey interactions also reveal a little overshoot and die-off. Pause the video and explain what you think is happening to the lynx and hare populations. And when you're ready to check your explanation, play again and go to the next slide. Population oscillations of lynx and hares are dictated by food. Oh, and if you didn't know, a hare is like a bunny rabbit. The populations are hovering around carrying capacity. So carrying capacity for the hare is probably right around here, 40 hares per 1,000, okay, or 40,000 hares, sorry. So we have 40,000 hares is the carrying capacity here, okay? And then the lynx population probably is a little under 20,000 lynx for carrying capacity. So they're hovering around their carrying capacity, they're overshooting and die off. That's happening because this shows density dependence of the hares and the lynx on increased predation. Both species exhibit repeated oscillations of abundance, with the lynx population peaking around 1 to 2 years after the hare population. Wolves prey on moose. Notice that the wolves keep the moose population in check. That means they had a high density. When a canine virus struck, the wolves were so close to one another, they probably just infected one another because their density was high. The wolf population crashed. This was absolutely density dependent for this crash to happen. It was a density dependent event, and the predator control of prey population was no longer in check. So they died, and because a whole bunch of them died, they weren't able to keep the moose in check, and then the moose population grew quickly. The moose didn't have as many predators, so their population increased big time. And there's information about it again. This is a classic case study of the Isle Royale. All right, so test yourself on these things, and if you don't remember how to explain them all scientifically and with your technical terms, then you should go back and listen or study. All right, now let's look at survivorship curves. So different species have distinct patterns of survivorship over the lifespan. We have excellent survivorship until old age for type 1, and we're going to look at type 1. This is the blue line. A whale, a human, an elephant, they're type 1. They have excellent survivorship. So this is the number of survivors in the population. So when the whales are born, most of them keep living. They live till they're 5 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old, 20 years old, and so on and so on. And then as they get older, that's when a whole lot of them start dying. That's a type 1 curve, and it's for mostly K-selected species. Then we have the type 2 survivorship. This is the relative constant decline. Many organisms have a little bit of both type 1 and type 3, so those are the ones that show more of this pattern for the number of survivors over each year or each unit of time. Both K and R, including tuna and redwood trees that have long maturity but high number of offspring and no parental care, they're usually in here. Corals and squirrels are also in here. And then we have our low rate of survivorship. This is our selected species are in here, like roaches. So a lot of roaches die almost as quickly as like right after they're born, and not as many make it to old age. That's type 3. Elephants cannot have babies until around age 13. Keep that in mind for what I'm about to talk about. So I just showed you type 1. K-selected species are going to fit in the type 1 niche, and R-selected are type 3 in the curve. So we have K and R, and these are strategies for reproduction and part of survival. Make sure you understand this. So let's use the elephant as an example for our K-selected species, and I'm going to walk you through how to compare. And really, if you can think of an elephant or, for a K-selected species and a roach for an R for roach, for an R-selected species, then you're going to remember these things. So it's K because, elephant is K, because it takes a while to get to carrying capacity. That's why we call it K. It takes a long time for that population to actually get to that S-shaped carrying capacity, the logistic growth, and to stay there. So the elephant lives for a long time, lifespan, long time, and the roach does not. The elephant cannot biologically have babies till it's around 13 years old. So long time to get there. Not the roach. The roach can in just a few weeks after it's born, it can have babies. Elephants only have a few babies, number of reproductive events in their entire lives. They only have a few babies. Roaches lay eggs, and then that's their reproductive event many times in their lifetime. Elephants only have a few babies. Roaches have hundreds of offspring. Elephants have big babies. Roaches are tiny. Elephants have parental care. They take care of their babies. They protect them, they feed them, and they care for them. Roaches do not. So again, Our type 1 survivors are going to be like our elephants and humans. Our type 2 are kind of like in the middle, constant decline in survivorship, and our type 3 are our roaches. Type 1, type 2, type 3. These are reproductive strategies. So make sure you study and that you understand those. All right, so we modeled parental care effects on a population of bubbles in class. Which type of survival strategist do you think the bubbles with a mama were? The bubbles with a mama. Were they K or were they R selected species? The ones where you were helping them out. You should have said the K selected species. Bubbles with a mama were type 1. They would have exhibited this type of curve. Most of the bubbles survived their infancy and toddlerhood because you were helping them. You were caring for them. Okay, so now we're going to jump to metapopulations. So you need to know about the habitat corridors, metapopulations, and inbreeding depression. These are examples of habitat corridors. These are critical to helping increase genetic diversity in a population. For example, if a metapopulation of cougars lives on one side of the highway over here and another on the other side of the highway over here, it would be very bad for the diversity of the population if they can't go visit each other once in a while, if they only breed with one another in their population. That means only brothers and sisters end up breeding with one another over here, and then only brothers and sisters breed over here. So, and that's inbreeding. This habitat corridor allows that to not happen as much. So this undesirable mutation can happen if they only breed with one another. When a cougar decides to take a long hike and visit another metapopulation or another neighborhood of cougars, he can mate with unrelated cougars. This introduces more and different genes to the gene pool. This is good. This makes it less likely for those undesirable mutations to pass on. So we need to encourage more habitat corridors so our little metapopulations can breed with one another and make sure that they increase that gene flow. So if we have more connectivity, more habitat corridors, the populations are going to have more genetic diversity and there's a better chance of survival of the entire population and the species. If they have no connectivity, there is going to be a problem with the population survival and probably the species survival. This is the one that was in your book. This figure was right in that section, and it demonstrates the movement of a visiting cougar through natural corridors. So we disrupt these natural corridors by building roads, building homes, and then they don't visit one another. And now we have to build those habitat corridors because most of the wild animals don't really want to cross highways. They're afraid of them. So our fragmentation is actually hurting the metapopulations. Humans suck. So this is a normal population, and this is a metapopulation. You can pause and read these on your own. This is what happens if neighboring cougars do not visit one another. Inbreeding. So the results of inbreeding cause an animal that has a mutation that probably is deleterious. It's detrimental. It's not going to help it survive. This is the result of inbreeding. So what is inbreeding? All right, if neighboring cougars do not visit, this is what happens. The mama, right here, who happens to have some kind of random or deleterious allele, mates with a papa. They have kids. Now follow the phylogenetic tree. Here are their 3 children. The one that did not get this trait, the one that got this trait, we'll call this the girl, and the one that did get the trait, we'll call this the boy. They're brother and sister, right? So they both had the allele from mama. They both passed the allele to their offspring. So that's their baby. They passed the allele on, and now the baby has that trait that we don't like. This brother also mated with someone that was not with the mutation and was probably could have been, let's say visited from another population. And because the trait was not passed on, that's good. That means that the genetic material is more diverse. So this is the result of inbreeding. All right, the Module 19 answers are here, And that's the end of modules 18 and 19.